Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct. Thank you guys so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host of Killer Instinct. And before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday and you are not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. Now, before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to just say a massive thank you to you guys for supporting me and all of your sweet comments on last week's episode when I mentioned to you guys that Killer Instinct has launched its own Patreon. If you didn't catch last week's episode, we did launch a Patreon, which will include 3 extra exclusive bonus episodes a month, in addition to a monthly live stream Q&A session. And it just made me so excited to see not only all of the support that you guys gave in the comments of that episode, but seeing so many of you join the Patreon really just made me excited for the future of what the Patreon looks like and what Killer Instinct looks like. It's just very exciting all the way around. So I wanted to say thank you for that, and also mention that if you have not yet signed up for the Patreon and you want to, it will be in the description box of this episode as well. It's also linked on my Instagram at Savannah Brimer, so you can find it over there. But with that being said, let's jump into the reason we are here today, which is to talk about the brutal murder of Jaime Melgar. And even though this case is technically solved, there are a lot of conflicting opinions on this case. There are many people who believe that the jury got it wrong in this case and that justice was not served the way it should be. And so I'm so curious to hear what you guys have to say today, and you will understand more as we dive into this case. So with that all being said, let's jump right on into it. So even though this case is about the tragic death of Jaime, there's no way we could start this episode without talking about Jaime's wife. Now, Sandra is Jaime's wife, and Sandra and Jaime met in high school. Jaime had actually lived most of his life in Houston after his family had immigrated from Guatemala, and Sandra had also moved to Houston as well after living in Laredo, Texas with her family. Now, Sandra and Jaime met when Sandra sat in front of Jaime in class, and Jaime used to poke fun at her by pulling her hair, really doing whatever he could to get Sandra's attention. And at one point, he had told Sandra that him and a bunch of friends were going to go ice skating, and he invited Sandra to join. But when Sandra got there, she realized very quickly that this group of friends that was supposed to be here at this ice skating rink didn't exist. And this really was Jaime's way of having one-on-one time with Sarah. He was too nervous to ask her out on a date on his own, so he figured that this would be an easier way to do it. And this was the beginning of their love story. It was their first date and the beginning of a lifelong relationship. They really became inseparable from that point on. They ended up getting married, and they would go on to have their daughter Liz together. Now, while raising Liz, Sandra was enrolled in nursing school, and Jaime worked as a computer programmer. As far as the Melgar household and the family in general, they were extremely family-oriented, they were very tight-knit, and they were also very involved in their church. Sandra and Jaime had joined the Jehovah's Witnesses pretty early on in their relationship, and their daughter Liz was involved in it as well. However, she left the church when she was 20 years old, but Sandra and Jaime continued practicing their faith. Now, Jaime himself was known for his goofy side, specifically his jokes. Jaime was always coming up with these jokes that was making everyone else roll their eyes because they were never great jokes. He was not going to become a stand-up comedian anytime soon, but he loved making people laugh. He was the king of the dad jokes, but he loved making people laugh, and he loved bringing joy and happiness to those around him. Now, alongside his family and his faith, something else that was really important to Jaime was his health. He was actually in great physical shape leading up to when this case really took place, which was in 2012. But he knew that he was getting older in age, and he decided that he wanted to take a stand when it came to his physical health. He started working out very consistently, and he started eating a very healthy diet. He wanted to make sure he was in the best physical shape, and that is exactly what he was doing. Now, like I mentioned, this case began in 2012, and in December of 2012, Jaime and Sandra were celebrating their 32nd wedding anniversary, and this was supposed to be on December 16th, 2012. That is when their anniversary was. However, Sandra wasn't feeling well because she was dealing with her own set of health issues. I just spoke about how Jaime was really active. He was very much taking care of himself physically, but Sandra, on the other hand, definitely had her fair share of health struggles, unfortunately. She had been dealing with lupus, she had several rounds of chemotherapy, she also had epilepsy. So Sandra's health definitely fluctuated, and when she wasn't feeling good, it was important for her to take that time to rest and recover. So when she wasn't feeling great on their 32nd wedding anniversary, which again was December 16th, they decided to forego any anniversary celebration and wait until Sandra was feeling better. And a little over a week later, on December 22nd, she was. So Sandra and Jaime decided to go out and celebrate their wedding anniversary at a local Mexican restaurant. It was a very low-key and chill night, but it was still something fun for them to do together to celebrate. So now I want to fast forward to the following day, which was December 23rd. And on this specific day, Sandra and Jaime had plans with their niece and Jaime's brother. The plan is that Jaime's niece Marissa and his brother Herman were going to come over to Jaime and Sandra's house to spend time with them, just enjoy each other's company. It was going to be a relaxing afternoon. And Jaime's niece Marissa had actually texted Jaime when her and her dad were on the way over, but she never got a response back from Jaime, which she did say was unusual. Now, Marissa and Herman arrived to the house at around 4:00 p.m. that afternoon, and when they went to the door and knocked, they didn't get any answer, which again was very unlike Jaime and Sandra. Herman then began walking around the home, canvassing the house. He walked to the back of the house and did not see Jaime or Sandra inside, but they did see Jaime's truck in the driveway. Herman actually did notice when looking at Jaime's truck that the garage door was open, and because that garage door was open, they were actually able to access the inside of the home from the door that was inside of the garage because that door was unlocked. So now they had entry into the home. Now, when Marissa and Herman walked into the house, they began calling out for Jaime and Sandra, but they weren't getting any response. So right around the time that they were about to turn around and walk away, because at this point they figured maybe they left, maybe they forgot about the plans that they had already scheduled, they were about to leave the house. However, when they were about to walk out the door, that is when they heard some strange mumbling sounds that appeared to have sounded like Sandra. Now, at the time, Herman and Marissa did not know where these noises were coming from, but Herman immediately ran to Sandra and Jaime's bedroom, and he was then able to see that the noises were coming from inside the primary bathroom, so inside of Sandra and Jaime's bathroom. Herman immediately tried to open the master bathroom door, which was located inside of the master bedroom, but he noticed pretty automatically that the door had been jammed. There was something that was pushed up against the other side of the door on the inside of the bathroom that was blocking him from getting inside. So he used more strength, and he was finally able to open the bathroom door, and he saw that a chair, the dining room chair, had appeared to be pushed up underneath the door handle of the door, which is what was blocking him from getting inside. But once he got into the bathroom, this is when he discovered Sandra sitting in the master closet with her hands tied behind her back. Now, immediately, Herman ran into the closet to untie Sandra's hands, and Marissa at this point was dialing 911, but it was while she was on the phone, she looked over over to the other side of the room and noticed that in one of the closets inside of the bedroom, there were a pair of ankles that were sticking out from the closet. Now, immediately once she got closer, that is when she discovered her Uncle Jamie's body. It was apparent right off of the bat that Jaime had been viciously and brutally murdered. There was blood absolutely everywhere in this closet. There was a red rope wrapped around his chest and a phone cord wrapped around his ankles. And after Sandra had been untied, she immediately ran over to Jamie's body to see if he had a pulse, but unfortunately, it was too late and he did not. Jaime had been killed. Now, when first responders arrived to the scene, they didn't really know much about what they were about to walk into. They knew that there was potentially 2 victims, but when they walked into the home and saw Jaime, they knew that something absolutely horrific had taken place. Jaime had suffered from multiple stab wounds all over his chest and his torso, and in total, he had been stabbed 31 times. Now, the EMTs also assessed Sandra and her injuries. And for Sandra, the only thing that she was really complaining about at that time was that her head was hurting her, and that was it. Regardless of anything else that was happening, she really wasn't complaining about any other pain that she was experiencing. Now, when the EMTs were asking Sandra about what had happened, what had taken place, Sandra told them that she did not remember a single thing. She said that she was very disoriented. She was asking what time it was, what day it was, if it was the morning or if it was the afternoon. She was also explaining to the EMTs that it was very possible that she had experienced a seizure. Like I had just previously mentioned, Sandra did have epilepsy, and she explained that it was common for her to experience a seizure and fall asleep for several hours. That is something that has taken place and happened to her before. So she thought that it was very possible that that had happened again that night. But again, when the EMTs were asking her what had happened, she claimed that she did not remember a single thing. She did not know how she ended up in the closet. She did not know how Jaime was murdered. She did not remember anything. And Sandra actually denied going to the hospital and immediately wanted to go to the police station to speak with the investigators to try and figure out what exactly happened here. So that's exactly what happened. After being given the green light by the EMTs, Sandra was brought down to the police station to answer some questions from the investigators. And according to Sandra, her and Jaime went out to dinner to celebrate their anniversary on December 22nd at approximately 8 p.m. They went to their local Mexican restaurant, and afterwards, they stopped off at their local CVS to grab some mixers. They were going to make some cocktails when they got back to the house and kind of keep the celebration going. So they stopped off at CVS to grab these mixers, and they ended up getting home around midnight. So they were gone for a few hours before getting back to the house. Sandra said that once they got back home, they were making cocktails, they grabbed strawberries and whipped cream, and they sat in their bathtub in their master bedroom for 2 hours. Sandra said that they were just talking and drinking and enjoying each other's company. After about that 2-hour mark, Sandra then went on to say that her and Jamie's dogs, who were outside at the time, they were barking. So in this moment, Jaime said that he was going to go and grab the dogs and move them from being outside into Jamie's office. Sandra said that they did this because sometimes the neighbors would complain that the dogs would be outside barking, so they tried to get ahead of that and move the dogs inside to keep them more quiet. Sandra said that she remained in the bathtub while this was happening. After a few moments had gone by, Sandra said she then realized that Jaime was gone for longer than he should have been. It was taking him longer to get the dogs into the office than it would have typically. So that is when she got out of the bathtub, went into the closet with the intention of changing and then going to check on Jaime. But that is when she says that her memory goes blank. She said going into the closet was the last and final thing that she remembered before waking up with her hands tied behind her back. She again reiterated to police that she figured that she possibly had a seizure in that moment and fell asleep for several hours. Now, as far as Sandra's demeanor goes, goes, Sandra was in absolute hysterics when at the police station. She was crying and she was just devastated by what was happening. After speaking to authorities, she then went to stay at a friend's house where her friends and family gathered around her. And all of Sandra's loved ones said that she was physically shaken up in the days after the murder and that her whole world had flipped upside down because it had. Now, their daughter Liz was actually living in Europe around the time of Jamie's murder, and she ended up traveling back home to Texas to be with her mom, and they were really just trying to navigate through this next chapter of their grieving. Now, with Liz being back in Texas, it did give police the opportunity to speak with her and really just try to put some of the pieces together as to what could have happened here. And when speaking to authorities, Liz did confirm that Sandra did have trouble with her memory in general because of her epilepsy and her seizures. And Liz reiterated that she believed that her mom must have had a seizure during the home invasion, which, even though that could have caused her to not remember anything and have her memory go completely blank, Liz believed it also could have saved her life as well. Liz theorized that if home invaders saw Sandra seizing, it could have startled them. They could have gotten freaked out. They could have decided to just flee the scene quickly, thinking that Sandra was going to die anyways. Now, detectives did ask Liz if they could all go back to Sandra and Jamie's home and canvass it to see if Liz noticed anything that was out of place or missing that could potentially lead them to a suspect, which Liz agreed to do. Now, when Liz arrived to the home, she began looking over everything, and this is when she noticed something a little bit strange. In the garage of the home is when Liz discovered her middle school backpack with an Xbox console inside of it, and underneath the Xbox was some of Sandra's jewelry. Now, Liz was adamant that this was not there before. This was not something that her parents kept in the garage with the Xbox controllers. It all just seemed very strange, and Liz definitely believed that this could have pointed to a robbery gone wrong. They thought it was very possible that alleged burglars could have used the backpack to stuff different items into it and then tried to run away, but for some reason they left the backpack behind. So it definitely raised some questions. And after police brought Liz to the home, they continued talking to her about anyone who she believed could have potentially wanted to hurt her parents or hurt Jamie. And Liz did have several people that she believed that the authorities should look into, the first of those being Liz's ex-husband. Liz had been previously married to a man who had a history of drug problems, and the marriage ended for that reason. In the years that Liz and her ex-husband were together, her ex had stolen some of Sandra's medication on several different occasions and had a history of drug arrests, and Liz just did not want to be married to someone who was involved in that lifestyle. So because of that, the marriage ended. So that was the first person that Liz told police that they should look into. And the second was a tenant of Jamie's. Jamie and Sandra had a property that they leased out, and Jamie had some tension with a specific tenant of his. Now, along with those two people, the ex-husband and the tenant, there were multiple tips that neighbors of Sandra and Jamie had called into the police who said that there was a suspicious man in the weeks leading up to the murder who had been lurking around the neighborhood. He was stealing items from homes and pawning them off. So those were the three main leads that were given to police. It was the ex-husband, it was the tenant, and it was this suspicious unidentified male. But the detectives were really not disclosing any information to the family as far as what they believed to have happened, what they theorize, who they think could have been responsible for this. They really were not revealing much about the investigation to the public or to the family. And a lot of people believe that the reason for that was because to police, there was another theory that was not being tapped into just yet. From the very beginning, police really struggled believing Sandra's story. They felt like there were a lot of holes in Sandra's timeline of events that could be poked into. For starters, they really struggled with Sandra's lack of memory on the night of the murder. And to give you guys an understanding on the timeline of this, Sandra blacking out for as long as she stated that she did, would have meant that she would have been blacked out for 14 hours. Now, whether that was her sleeping for 14 hours or whether that was just her memory not coming to her for 14 hours, her having a 14-hour memory blank, that is the timeline and the time frame that we're looking at. Now, Sandra and Jaime were found just feet away from each other in separate closets in the same room. So police had a hard time believing that Sandra could have gone that long without having any recollection or any memory, with them being in such close proximity to each other. Now, Sandra saying that her last known memory was her going into the closet to change doesn't explain how her hands were tied behind her back. Police just struggled to understand the logic in tying Sandra's hands behind her back if robbers did come in, if this was a robbery gone wrong. If we're going with that theory, and these robbers walk into the closet and they see Sandra seizing, why would they take the time to tie her hands behind her back? They didn't really understand why that would happen, why that would be the logic, if they ended up fleeing anyways, or if they assumed that she was going to die because she was seizing. Now, there were also several inconsistencies in Sandra's story that the detectives were struggling with, and that first inconsistency is the time frame in which Jaime was gone when Sandra says that he went to bring the dogs inside. Sandra initially said that Jaime was gone for about 15 to 20 minutes, but after that, in her second version of the story, she then said that Jaime was only gone for 5 minutes. Now, some may just call that semantics, but for police, it really did strike them as a red flag. Now, more than that, Sandra also went as far as changing her story on the dogs barking in general. She initially said that she was not the one who heard the dogs barking at all, and that it was Jaime who heard them barking because she said that he had better hearing than she did. But then in her second version of events, she told police that she was the one who heard the dogs barking because they were barking right outside of the window of that master bathroom where Jaime and Sandra were. Now, you could say that these inconsistencies were due to shock, but again, they definitely raised police's suspicion because certain things were not adding up. Now, I want to talk about the crime scene itself for a moment, because when police arrived at the scene and began investigating the home, they discovered that there was a lot of blood found near Jaime's body. Obviously, he had suffered from 31 stab wounds. There was going to be blood. There was also blood discovered in the master bedroom carpet. But along with that, there was also a large kitchen knife that was discovered on the bottom of the bathtub. Now, again, this was the bathtub that Jaime and Sandra were using. So because of that, the bathtub was still full of water. And unfortunately, because of that, because the knife had been sitting in a bathtub full of water, that means that any potential DNA that could have been found on that kitchen knife was automatically washed away. So even though the kitchen knife was found in the bottom of the bathtub, the police were not able to pull any DNA off of that. But other than those two pieces of evidence, the blood and the kitchen knife, there was nothing else for police to really go off of here. There was no forced entry into the home. There were some signs of a robbery because some of the drawers were pulled out, some of the cabinets, some of the dresser drawers, but there was nothing taken from them. And that was the big takeaway here. There were no valuables taken. Sandra had a whole jewelry box full of jewelry, but nothing was taken from it. Even the jewelry that was found in the backpack that was found later in the garage, that was left there. All of the valuables that were in the home remained in the home. So whoever did this did not take anything with them. And again, when talking about DNA, there really was no DNA evidence found anywhere in the home. There was very little, if any at all. Again, the knife had no DNA on it. There was also no DNA found on Jaime's body or on Sandra's of any other potential suspect. And I do want to say, along with that, Sandra's DNA was not found on Jaime, and Jaime's DNA was not found on Sandra. So at this point, police really were at a standstill in this investigation. They had no evidence that was pointing them to a potential suspect, but still, police were very, very suspicious of Sandra, but there really wasn't enough evidence to indict Sandra, but along with that, there was no other evidence to indict another suspect. Police really began theorizing that Sandra could have been the one that masterminded Jaime's murder. But again, because they really didn't have the evidence to build a case against her, they continued to wait. And it wasn't wasn't until July of 2014, so about a year and a half after the murder, that Liz and Sandra learned that Sandra had been indicted and charged with the murder of Jaime. Now, the reason they found this out actually is because Liz was staying with her mom at the time, and Liz went to go check the mailbox and saw countless flyers from attorneys who were looking to represent Sandra. And at the time, Liz and Sandra did not know what this was about. So at that point, Liz went to the Harris County website and she typed in Sandra's name, and that is when they discovered that Sandra had been charged with Jaime's murder. So that is how they learned about this at all. A grand jury had indicted Sandra several days prior to them learning about this. And so when Sandra learned about this herself, she actually turned herself in and she posted bail and then hired an attorney named Mac Seacrest. Now, everyone on Sandra's legal team, as well as Sandra's family, could not believe that she was being held responsible for something like this, mainly because of the lack of evidence. Now, while there really wasn't evidence pointing towards any other suspect, there also wasn't evidence pointing towards Sandra either. Many people didn't believe that this case would ever go to trial because of that lack of evidence. But 3 years after Sandra's charge in the summer of 2017, she elected her right to a speedy trial, and the trial was set to begin in August of 2017, and Sandra was pleading not guilty. Now, when this trial began, the prosecution self-admittedly said that they do not have much evidence against Sandra, but the one thing that they were going to use against her in this case, the one thing that they were going to break apart was her story, her lack of memory, her blackout for a 14-hour period, her inconsistencies. Those were all going to be used against Sandra in her trial to prove that she was the one who did this. The prosecution brought up a neighbor of Jaime and Sandra's to testify to talk about the barking dogs that night, because that was a big point in the story. This is where the story really took a turn, because the dogs barking was the last time that Sandra says that she saw Jaime when he got up to let the dogs in. But a neighbor of Jaime and Sandra's testified that she was the one who constantly complained about these dogs barking. She said that they barked a lot, but on the night of the murder, this neighbor said that she did not hear the dogs barking at all, which again, the prosecution was using this neighbor to try and break down Sandra's story of the dogs barking. Now, the first responder who arrived to the scene, she testified as well, and she said that when she arrived to the home, something about the crime scene just seemed a little off. There were, again, those drawers that were pulled out, but nothing was missing or taken out of them. It was almost as if someone had tried to do just enough to make it appear as if this was a home invasion. Now, the prosecution also spoke about Sandra's health problems, saying that she had been regularly visiting her doctors and had been on medication to help with her seizures, and that leading up to the murder, she hadn't had a seizure for years. So the prosecution was trying to argue here that Sandra was using these seizures as a scapegoat, and that she would have had more than enough time. She would have had 14 hours worth of time to stage the house to make it look like a crime scene, to make the house look ransacked, because she knew that Jaime's niece and his brother were coming over the next day. So they tried to make it seem like she was blaming her seizures that she hadn't had in years for her lack of memory, but in reality, she was using her seizure as a scapegoat to be able to say that that's why she didn't remember anything, and instead, she didn't have a seizure, and was using that as her excuse as to why she was able to go the 14 hours to make sure the house looked like there was a robbery gone wrong. The prosecution really emphasized that there was a lot that could be done in 14 hours. The DNA could have been wiped off in 14 hours. Anything that Sandra wanted to do towards the house to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, she would have been able to do in that time. Now, I want to take a second and talk about motive, because I know you're probably sitting here wondering, why on earth would Sandra want to murder Jaime? Because I felt the same way. I was like, what is the motive here? Why would she want to do this? These are high school sweethearts. They've been together for years. They were celebrating their 32nd wedding anniversary. But like I mentioned in the beginning, Jaime and Sandra were Jehovah's Witnesses, and as a part of this religion, they do not believe in divorce. So the prosecution really leaned into this and used this as the motive, the potential motive for why Sandra would have wanted to murder Jaime, which would have been that she wanted to get a divorce. She felt like she couldn't because of her religion, and so the only way out of it was for Jaime to be dead. Now, I also want to take a moment and talk about Jaime's injuries because this was brought up during the trial as well. Like I mentioned, Jaime had been stabbed a total of 31 times, but the medical examiner took the stand and concluded that none of the cuts were very deep, which gave prosecution the opportunity to theorize that Sandra very well could have been the one to stab him. Even though there were many stab wounds on Jaime, they weren't very deep cuts, so it wouldn't have taken too much strength to have stabbed him 31 times. That's what the prosecution was trying to argue, because from the defense's side, they were saying that Sandra had this laundry list of health issues that she had been experiencing. She didn't have the strength to murder Jaime. She didn't have the strength to stab him 31 times, but the prosecution argued otherwise. Now, in terms of what happened on the night of the murder from the prosecution standpoint, they painted a picture to the jury that Sandra lured and seduced Jaime into bed and then used a knife that was laying out of Jaime's sight to begin stabbing him, and that is when the attack began. She then staged the house, placed the chair in front of the bathroom door that she was discovered in, tied her hands behind her back, and waited for Jaime's family. The prosecution played a video to the jury of the detectives demonstrating how a chair could have been placed in front of the door. This was really trying to justify that Sandra very well could have done this herself, and she would have had ample time to do it. She would have had 14 hours to do it. And as far as the tying the hands behind her back, the DA presented how it's pretty simple to tie your own hands behind your back, and there were no bruises or ligature marks on Sandra's wrist that would have shown that she was tied up for hours or that her hands were tied up very tightly. It didn't seem like she was restrained for a very long period of time. So that is what the prosecution was trying to paint the picture of. So that really was their argument from start to finish. Now, the defense argued that Sandra had been struggling with memory loss and seizures for a very long time. They essentially tore down the prosecution's theory by saying there was no evidence that pointed it to being true. It was all just theory. The defense really argued that Sandra was being falsely accused for her husband's murder because there was no one else to pin this crime to. But they point out the fact that there were other potential suspects that the police never looked into. For example, Liz's ex-husband or the suspicious unidentified male responsible for petty theft. They also shared that there was a similar home invasion that was carried out in the surrounding area of Jaime and Sandra's home that had an almost identical MO, but that was never investigated by authorities. Now, another big part of the defense's argument that they really leaned into was faulty police work, and that the lead detective on this case was actually involved in forging different warrants for different investigations. And because of that, this specific detective was forced to resign 2 years after Jaime's murder. So the defense was really questioning here the legitimacy of this detective and his moral compass. They emphasized that this was a heavily flawed investigation by detectives, and they mentioned that several days after the murder, Sandra had actually gone to the doctor to get a full examination, and it was found that she had a hematoma on her head, which could have been the result of her being hit over the head by an intruder. The defense really painted this picture that Sandra could have gone into the closet to change, an intruder could have come up behind her so that way she never saw him, and then she could have been hit over the head, which caused the hematoma and also caused a seizure, which made her lose her memory for that 14-hour period of time. The defense also mentioned that there was unknown male DNA found on the drawers and door handles of the master bedroom, as well as that backpack that was found in the garage. So there was unknown male DNA that was never looked into. Now, regardless of whether or not you believe that Sandra did or did not do this, when looking at Sandra in this trial, the defense definitely leaned into her presenting herself as a frail, older woman. She appeared small. She presented as someone who would never even yell at someone, let alone murder someone. She was walking around the courtroom with a cane. She was dressed very well. She just appeared like a kind older woman, and that could be because that's exactly who she is, or some people believe that is because the defense wanted to portray her as such and not as a calculated murderer. But ultimately, after both parties had concluded their arguments, the verdict was now in the jury's hands. And after deliberation, the jury came back and found Sandra guilty of the murder of her husband, Jaime. Now, as you can imagine, everyone in Sandra's family was absolutely shocked to hear this verdict, but regardless, Sandra was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Now, in 2022, the Innocence Project of Texas actually took on this case and is actively working to have Sandra's conviction overturned, but as far as where it stands today, Sandra is still in jail and her conviction is still being upheld, and she was found guilty of the murder of Jaime. And that, you guys, is this case really. This case is a frustrating one for a multitude of reasons. I feel as if there really isn't enough evidence to point in any direction. It just feels like there's a big missing piece to this puzzle, and I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about it. Do you believe that Sandra is guilty? And do you believe she murdered her husband because she wanted a divorce? She wanted to get out of the marriage, and she thought the only way to do that was murder? Or do you believe she's being framed and the real killer is still out on the loose? Let me know in the comments below. But with that being said, you guys, that is all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I'm your host of Killer Instinct. Make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday, and you're not going to want to miss it. Again, we upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. I will be back next week with a brand new one for you guys, and until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.